Africa Union Summit is going to be held on 17th and 18th of February. So African head of states and governments will gather together here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to discuss on issues of peace, security, integration and development. On this two-day summit, these leaders of Africa are expected to come up with innovative ideas that can bring and sustain peace, integration and development in the continent. Hello and welcome. You are watching Amhara Media Corporation. Today, we'd like to share you information and perspectives regarding these trending issues of Africa: peace, security, integration and development. Joining me is Dr. Emmanuel Zwambin, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy at Il Amin University, Nigeria. So we are reaching Dr. Emmanuel via Skype. He is in Nigeria today. Hello, Dr. Emmanuel. Fantastic to meet you.
Thank you very much and for having me.
All right. Dr. Emmanuel, allow me to say a few words about yourself. So like I said before, Dr. Emmanuel Zwambin is a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy at Il Amin University, Nigeria. He also serves as a policy and strategy researcher at the Nigerian House of Representatives there in Nigeria. He has published several articles and researches, some of which are transitional justice in Nigeria, populism and Chinese mega projects in Africa, shitoles in Africa, politics, regional integration, security, resource conflicts, African continental free trade area, and so on. Dr. Emmanuel, it's an honor to have you in my show.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Let's begin with your knowledge of Ethiopia. How do you come to know Ethiopia? Let's begin with this, Dr. Emmanuel.
Well, as a student of history, we all know that Ethiopia is an epitome that represents African independence and shows the civilization of African people. So we know Ethiopia from our school books. And then, of course, when we talk about African unity, we see Ethiopia as representing that. Yeah.
All right. Dr. Emmanuel, the central theme of our interview will circumnavigate around the 2024 African Union agenda. And like I said before, the agenda of this year for the African Union are peace, security, integration and development. Let us begin with peace and security. You know, many of conflicts in Africa are ethnic-based ones. So where are the origins of these ethnic-based conflicts? You know, some people say the origins of ethnic-based conflicts are in colonial era, so they associate it with colonialism. Others say it's absence of democracy. Others say it is a competition over resource. Others might associate it with poverty and so on. Anyway, in your mind, what are the root causes of ethnic-based conflicts, and more profoundly on your research and analysis, where this ethnic-based conflicts originates from?
Definitely, if we are looking at African conflict, it is multidimensional. The factors, we can look at only the colonial factor. So if we are going to analyze African conflicts on the basis of colonial impacts, what about Ethiopia? Ethiopia was never colonized, but it's got internal conflicts. So for me, I see the end of Cold War and globalization as a major impacting factor on conflict in Africa. But then I can see conflict as an institutional problem. Since post-African era, Africans are unable to strengthen institutions, democratic values, inclusion. So once you have this system, you are likely to have a reduced level of identity-based. Is it religion we're talking about? Is it ethnicity we're talking about? Is it the clash of values we're talking about? All these are key factors that are driving conflict in Africa. Of course, climate change is a big problem. People having to move from one to another in search of resource. And then there's a clash with the host community. But I see more the conflict in Africa as a problem of weak institutions, violence embedded in our institutions, where people are included, where the power elites are determined to exclude other people. And then you find the vulnerability of the people because of poverty, and then being instigated by other elites who are interested in. And so we find ourselves divided alongside religion or ethnicity or whatever values or geographical locations of the people. So basically, these are the factors that are driving conflict. Of course, you all know that interstate conflict has completely gone off in Africa. We're dealing with intrastate, and they are institutional problems. Governance, power is a key issue. Economic resources, it's a key issue as well.
Yeah. All right. So you associate the problem of conflict in Africa with weak institutions, am I right?
Yes, correct.
So in which areas should African countries work to permanently address such kinds of conflicts?
Now, let me be very frank with you that even framework like the African Peace and Security Architecture looks fantastic, okay? But how much commitment do we have when African countries are still protecting their sovereignty? Recently, we had this issue of Kenya trying to intervene in DRC, between the conflict between DRC and those militia who are purportedly believed to be sponsored by Rwanda. We had all those crises that the DRC Congo is not comfortable with Kenya. Okay, even the deployment of the East African standby force is still also in question. Is it the issue of Sudan, where Sudan does not accept Kenya as a neutral party? So the suspicion, the fear among African states, the protectionism of regime is basically a big constraint to interventions in managing conflict in Africa. And then the other thing we talk about, you can keep talking about an African solution for African conflict when the bulk of the financing comes from Europe, America. How will you deal with that? So basically, I can tell you that the commitments of African leaders is a mere rhetoric. We're not serious about this. I can tell you. Yes, we admit it's a big problem, but I don't see a proactive approach to dealing with conflicts in Africa. Just so when you look at the military coup in Niger, in Guinea, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and we saw how America and other countries are, fighting to restore democracy. And then we have another form of civilian coup where a civilian government rises up and truncates elections, or leaders subverting institutions, taking advantage of their powers and manipulating law enforcement agencies, intimidating judiciary. What coup is more than that? And we have not had much comments coming from African Union or ECOWAS to say this is not acceptable. Coup is not only when the military takes over power, when people who have access to power manipulate processes. That is coup. And that's what we're seeing in Africa.
All right. That is super insightful indeed. Integration is one of the top agenda of the 2024 African Union Summit. Import and export between and among African states is very low. In particular, if we compare this trend with other continents like Europe, the reality, the figure is shocking. So what are the problems? What are the root causes that hinders trade between and among African countries?
So African problem in terms of integration can be traced back from the foundation of the formation of Organization for African Unity, where you have different groupings who are not really committed to total integration. But I can tell you we've gone away from that since the formation of African Union and then the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is one of the largest, if you like, in the world, and one of the most pragmatic steps that African people have taken to integrate Africa. But I can tell you we have a big Look at infrastructure. Our infrastructure is not integrated. If I'm going to make a call from here to Ethiopia or to Kenya, to Uganda, it's more expensive to make a call to China or to the US. Why? If I'm going to fly from Nigeria to Kenya, it's probably the same cost of flight to fly into China. Because our framework are not integrated, internet facility is not integrated, banking system is not integrated, transport system is not integrated, energy is not integrated. So we have fragmented infrastructural development, which is not helping to enhance integration or trade. The other issue is the issue of payment, which the African Pre-Continental Trade Area has settled by bringing in the Pan-African payments and settlement system, which is fantastic. If I want to buy from Ethiopia, I don't have to pay in dollars, going to SWIFT or going to HSBC before it's cleared and come back to Ethiopia. Now I can settle with Naira and buy tea from Ethiopia, which is a good thing we have done. So for me, we're making progress. For the first time, Africans are making progress, and we'll see if that happens. But I have a problem. My problem is that while we are taking practical efforts to integrate Africa in terms of policies, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of trade, we have forgotten that social integration is a major sector of this integration. Africans, we have refused to accept each other. A Ugandan sees Kenya as a different person. A South African sees a Nigerian as a different person. We would rather accept white friendly to them than to accept a fellow African. You can never have trade without moving around. Moving around, trading and working. And that framework is not effective yet. Even if you put policies of an African visa system or passport, are we willing to accept ourselves? So we must do more by pushing Pan-Africanist idea, that brotherhood, where people will accept that we are not a problem to each other, will rather support. I keep saying this. Nigeria spends about 1.3 billion to import dairy products. And yet in Uganda and Kenya, they throw away milk because no market to buy. Just imagine Nigeria buying that, or having Ugandans and Kenyans going to Nigeria to set up dairy farms. That will be useful for Africa, not all these protectionists. Chino Achebe say, when brothers fight, a stranger reap the harvest. And that's what we're suffering. Keep fighting ourselves. We don't like ourselves.
Sorry, Dr. Emmanuel. Can you hear that Chino Achebe is saying? Can you hear it again?
When two brothers fight, a stranger reap the harvest.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. I have lived in East Africa, and I also blame my country. Our visa regime is very stringent. Africans cannot easily work in Africa and move freely in Africa. The cost of work permit in Africa is too expensive. A white person can pay for it, who comes from Europe. Paying $2,000 is not a big deal. But a poor African cannot afford to pay for that. Nigeria has got a lot of professors. Kenya is looking for professors. We've got a lot of doctors. Kenya went to Cuba to bring doctors, when we have a lot of them in Nigeria or elsewhere in Africa or South Africa. I don't understand what and why we do what we are doing for ourselves. When we have cheap labor in Africa, I'm happy with Uganda that went to employ teachers from Zimbabwe, which is a good thing. Let's do that. Let's do more. Complement ourselves. You have comparative advantage in East Africa. You do a lot of tea, you do a lot of dairy. In West Africa, no. We don't have that. Why can't we exchange what we have in terms of manpower, in terms of ideas, in terms of values? Why can't we exchange that? We have our leaders flying Addis Ababa, deciding on framework that will never work. It's a big problem I have, and I believe we should look towards social integration strategy for African people.
All right. Thank you very much for your brilliant ideas and insights. You know, your thoughts is really impressive. And thank you for reminding us, Chino Achebe, you know, the great icon in African literature. Thank you very much. Let us have your recommendation on ways of fostering regional integration in Africa. What needs to be done, really?
I can tell you, first and foremost, we need to promote the idea of Pan-Africanism. We are Africans. We believe we're Africans. We share common history and common values. We've gone through a lot. We must embrace each other. That's first and foremost. Second, we need to have Africans that are pragmatic, who believe in Africa. We can't keep talking about Africa when we are not committed to supporting African values and ideals. I remember some years ago when Paul Kagame recommended to African leaders to remit a portion of their custom duty, I think about 1% to African Union, to fund the African Union. But African leaders refused to accept. How would you talk about Pan-Africanism and you are funded by China, funded by Europe, funded by America? Then African leaders are not committed to that. Look at the hunger that we are going through. Look at the climate change crisis we are going through. Look at the impacts of COVID-19. We had to depend on China and Europe to give us vaccine. We're not making progress. Okay, so I would like a pragmatic system where African intellectuals will be involved in putting out robust research. Let us turn the African Union into a system of research in terms of whether social research or scientific research. Let's empower young people. Let's create forum for Pan-Africanism that we can embrace ourselves. I can tell you there's a lot of potentials. I have no doubt about Africa, that we have potential with good leadership.
Let us talk about African Union itself. The 2024 African Union Summit is going to be held after a few days, and leaders of Africa are going to come to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, as usual. Some critics say like African Union has not done something enough to overcome some of the recurrent issues in Africa, like insecurity, instability, lack of peace, and so on. What is your assessment in this regard?
Well, I am very, very critical of Africa, but I'm also a pragmatist. I believe that we have made progress since 2022. 2000, we have made progress. African Union, definitely compared to Organization for African Unity, we have made a lot of progress. We have seen this move towards embracing democracy. That I can assure you. But I can tell you we're dealing with poverty, climate change impact. African leaders aren't doing enough. Money laundering is a big problem. African elite politicians are stealing our money and moving those money in huge chunks to other countries. We can develop. Let's talk about basic things. I have no problem that Africa can deal with its problem. But I have problem that African leaders fly to Addis Ababa, make noise, and fly back. And that is it. It ends there. If we're committed to all the regimes, the values, and the frameworks that are put in place, I can tell you they are fantastic. My concern for this meeting is that we want to see commitment. And Africans should speak with full voice. You can go to Chad, for example, and have the president dies, and then you crown his son, and you call that democracy. And all African leaders keep quiet about that. Then you go to another country, then you criticize the country. We must speak with one voice. We must legitimize good governance. We must move away from hypocrisy. And I can tell you that Africans, our problem is also external. A lot of African leaders are committed, but the external forces are overwhelming, and they cannot allow them to move towards a more integrated system that promotes African unity, that promotes African kind of development. They will not allow that, because Africa is the next continent for development. Who is against that? It's a big question we may need to answer in the future.
What is expected from today's generation of Africa in fostering African Union, in strengthening African Union? You know, our forefathers, like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and other prominent forefathers of Africa had already established African Union. They have done their part. They have done something incredible. They have lifted many African countries from colonialism. So they have done their part. So what's expected from today's generation of Africa in further strengthening African Union?
I can tell you that African youths are committed to the continental Africa much more than our forefathers. I can tell you that. We are more enlightened. But if we can promote what I call the social integration, if we can embrace each other as young people, I can tell you that Africa will be somewhere. Look at the kind of inventions and innovations of young African people who had to leave Africa to Europe or America. Look at the exploit they are doing, and nobody survives without the diaspora. If we can promote diasporic diplomacy, where we can have African people to return back to Africa and find good environment to express their skills and ideas, I can tell you Africa is going to grow. Not to have a system where one leader wakes up and manipulates institutional policies. No investment will grow. We need African people to return back to Africa. They are the ones who are genuinely committed to African development. When they bring their investments to Africa, they will be committed to getting it moved. It's not a capital flight. They will build Africa, invest in Africa, and leave Africa develop. When we talk about foreign investors, who else do you want other than African people coming back to Africa? Provide a conducive environment for African people to return, you know. And that's what I think.
Africa is a huge continent. It's a huge continent by population size, by land size, by resource, and by many parameters. Africa is a prospective continent, isn't it? But Africa has not get fair representation at United Nations Security Council. How annoying is this?
Unfortunately, nobody is going to promote Africa but Africans. We've done a lot, like you've said. I'm happy that you are pushing the African ideas through the media, which is a good thing. We keep talking about, for example, look at Africa-China relations. The Confucius Center, where China sets up a cultural center to promote its values and others. What are we doing? Is there any African center or Ethiopian center in China where it's funded by Ethiopian government to promote Ethiopian values? No, we don't do that. So we are not on the offensive. We are not proactive. We are just reactive. So if we want to promote African voices, Africa would need to speak more. China did that for herself, and that's why China is using a lot of soft power through media, through cultural diplomacy. Africa would need to do that. I want to see Nigeria waking up one day and setting up Center for Nigerian Studies in China, funded by Nigerian government or in the US. Or you have an American government funding Center for African Studies in America. No, Africa should fund it, and that's the only way we want to be heard. Okay, Africa should support African media so we can have a bigger voice. The Middle East did that, and Al Jazeera is a voice for the Middle East. Tell me the media in Africa that has got that global coverage. So if this is one area that we want to see our leaders looking at that pragmatically to promote the media, to support African initiative that will promote African aspirations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, recently the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has also showed some kind of sympathy over African issue in terms of its representation in the United Nations Security Council. He said like it's not fair for Africa to not get representation in the United Nations Security Council. So really in recent days there are some consensus regarding the representation of Africa at this world stage. So what will be the benefits of Africa if it gets fair representation at this key world stage, United Nations Security Council?
So first let me say that the United Nations itself, particularly the Security Council, needs to be democratized. You can't talk about inclusion, governance, and then you exclude a chunk of over 1.3 billion people. They are not represented. Yes, we agree. The UN was formed when most African countries were still under colonial rule. Now we've gone out of that. We are out of Cold War. Why can't you put a framework where Africans can be part of it? Because if you do that, we will not have that invasion that happened in Libya, where NATO had to leave its areas of influence and jurisdiction and perpetuate influence in Libya. Today, we have the collapse of security in the Sahel. Because of that, Africa would have vetoed that and said, no, we will not allow that. It's an African problem, we will deal with that. Look at the impact of what happened in Libya today. It's gone cross from Sudan to Niger to Chad, Nigeria, to everywhere is impacted because of that. So Africa needs to be represented. We will say, no, you will not intervene. We will deal with that by our African framework. But when you have NATO, which basic value is or aspiration is about dealing with security in Europe, crossing its way all the way to Africa and causing this calamity in Africa is not acceptable. It's not. So we need African representation in the United Nations Security Council to protect African interests. Okay, so because we understand Africa, we will deal with this problem. Because our initial African battle in terms of conflict resolution is conciliatory. We tend to resolve our problem restorative system. We bring parties, we negotiate without war. But when we keep having wars, we have guns being, some people funding or giving arms to militias against a sitting government. It's not, look at what's happening in Sudan. Unfortunate. You know, it's unfortunate. We shouldn't allow that.
All right. African voice needs to be heard in this key global stage at the United Nations Security Council. Otherwise, the fates of Africa will be decided by outsiders. And this is not fair for Africa, and this is not good for the world as well. So how African leaders work together to get fair representation at the United Nations Security Council? Unfortunately,
there's already a rivalry. South Africa is interested. Nigeria is saying, no, we are the biggest economy in Africa. We should be the ones who represent. Kenya is interested. So I don't see us having a consensus, except if we have an arrangement where the permanent seats that will be given to Africa should be rotational. And then we put a framework. If we do that, then possibly we are going to have African support in that. But if we do not put framework, we want to give Nigeria or South Africa or Ethiopia or Kenya, you would find that Africans will not be united. That's my thinking. So we would have a permanency but rotational within Africa, or rotational on the basis of regions: East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and then South Africa. If that works for us, yeah, that would be good.
All right. So Dr. Emmanuel Zwambin, Senior Lecturer at the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy at El Amin University, Nigeria. Really thank you very much for sharing your in-depth knowledge and perspective regarding topic of our discussion, peace, security, integration and development of Africa. Really thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
So that brings us to the end of our program for today. Many thanks for watching, and please do stay with the rest of our programs. Bye for now.